Welcome to the Town Builders Podcast. I'm your host, Levi Wentz. Town Builders is produced by the NTBA, the National Town Builders Association, implementers of the new urbanism. Find out more at ntba.net. This podcast is sponsored by James Hardie, what the best are made of. James Hardie is America's #1 brand in siding. Their product is elegant and durable and is sure to elevate any building or development. So if you want to find out more, go to jameshardie.com or find them at your local building supplier. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Daniel Burnham was an American architect and founder of the City Beautiful movement, and his quote is one of my favorites and is such a good introduction for today's guest. The world of real estate development has high barriers to entry. The amount of red tape, politics, and bureaucracy, as well as just the demanding amount of capital, is enough to keep most people from even getting started. But imagine that didn't deter you. Imagine you weren't scared away and you did dare to not only dream, but to get started on that dream, even with no prior experience. Now imagine the project you're proposing is to build a brand new village that doesn't conform to anything within the regular zoning code on nearly 300 acres, all while navigating the uniquely challenging landscape of California politics and environmental regulation. Meet Devon Zuegel. I had the great opportunity to meet Devon a couple years back, and immediately what I loved is it's obvious she's driven by a deep curiosity and passion to make things better. Devon began her career as a software engineer in San Francisco, but through her time living there, she couldn't stop asking one question. Why do the places we live in have so many issues and are just so poorly designed? What started as a personal obsession led her down a rabbit hole of housing policy, urban planning, architecture, governance, and ultimately, town building. Her dream soon became a reality, and today she's the founder of Esmeralda, a new village in California's wine country. Esmeralda is set to blend the best of timeless urbanism and great architecture, what we would call the hardware, with a rich cultural layer and community, which Devon calls the software. In our conversation, we explore how her childhood summers in Chautauqua, New York, inspired the vision for Esmeralda, how she's building trust with investors, city officials, and future residents to make something that's truly enduring, how the investments and economics of town building actually work. We also talk about Edge Esmeralda, a month-long pop-up village and experimental campus that's a living prototype of the community she's working to build permanently. It's a beautiful collision of culture, urbanism, and no shortage of big plans. Now, whatever your background, Devon's story is inspiring, a masterclass in having courage, creativity, and taking the idea of community building to a whole nother level. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Devon Zuegel. Devon, thank you for coming on and doing this.
Oh, yeah.
I think one of the things that I'm really interested in talking with you about is sort of your origin story and how you got into this, because you didn't come through a typical pathway. If there is a typical pathway for real estate development, you didn't come through it. So I'd love to hear about your background as a software engineer and how you got into real estate development and building a new town, and also the inspiration that you have for the new town. You've talked about Chautauqua, which you're the only person I've ever heard use Chautauqua as their inspiration for building a new town. Oftentimes it's Rome or Paris or various new urbanist communities that people will bring up, Las Colinas or Seaside, something like that. But I think what's really interesting about Chautauqua in particular, as we'll discuss, is you're interested in sort of the culture piece first, the software piece of it. And that's what initially interested you in, coming up with this harebrained idea of building a new town. So do you be able to talk a little bit about your background and your inspiration getting to this point?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. This is going to be a really fun conversation. So this project, the Esmeralda project, really brings together a lot of different threads in my life that I didn't realize were related until a few years ago. One thread you mentioned is Chautauqua, which is this small town in Western New York, in the Great Lakes region of New York. It was built 150 years ago, and there's sort of two things that I think make it really special. One is that it was built before the car, and so even though cars are able to come into the community, it's really oriented around walking and biking. And I should mention my grandmother lives there. And so she has a little bit of trouble now walking around, but people who have mobility issues can scooter around. And there's so many ways you can get around Chautauqua without a car. And it's a sort of classic American small town where people sit on their front porches. They leave their bikes unlocked because it's super high trust. Just beautiful. Everywhere you walk, it's really beautiful. So that's the one side. And I like to call that the hardware. But the thing that really makes Chautauqua stand out is what I call the software. So for 9 weeks every summer, they host lectures and workshops and parades and kids camps. And every summer I'd visit my grandma there and I'd get to be part of the Boys and Girls Club that runs throughout the summer. My parents would go to the morning lecture every day. And it's this amazing way to really bring the whole community together with activities and programming and a shared sense of values. And in the case of Chautauqua, it's everyone there really values education and learning, and everyone's always trying to better themselves, whether they're 2 years old or 80 years old or anything in between. Everyone's constantly learning. And it's kind of like what you can really imagine is it's like a liberal arts college campus, but it's multi generational. And so growing up, going to Chautauqua was really, I think, foundational for who I became, but also really for what we've ended up building for Esmeralda as well. And so that's like one thread. Another thread you talked about was my own professional background, which seems completely unrelated. But for many years, I was in the software industry in San Francisco. In school, I studied computer science and economics, and I thought I was going to go into the software business really for the rest of my life. But it's hard to live in San Francisco and not get obsessed with the housing question and why such a beautiful city with so much wealth has so many problems. I think the annual budget is something like $15 billion, which is larger than the GDP of some countries. And somehow there's still people like sleeping on the sidewalk and the infrastructure is falling apart. And so from living there, as much as I loved working in software, I really got obsessed with this question of like, why is this place that we live in such a tough place? And that took me down the rabbit hole of housing policy and architecture and urbanism and policy and governance. And over time, I started realizing I wanted to work on those problems. And I thought about the places that I loved most in the world, and Chautauqua is just number one on that list.
Right.
But having grown up on the West Coast, Chautauqua was a bit far away. And really, my community is centered around San Francisco Bay Area. And so I thought, what would it look like to build a modern day version of Chautauqua that is really oriented towards technology and the Bay Area and sort of the unique culture that's there?
What is Chautauqua's origin story? Because it has this really unique history in this 9-week seminar. How did all that come about?
So, 150 years ago, a bunch of Sunday school teachers got together. And 150 years ago, it was hard to get books. They were very expensive, and most people didn't have access to higher education. But these teachers really wanted to better themselves and understand the world better. So, they got together and they swapped books basically by the lakeside and they like camped for, I think it was 2 weeks. And they had such a good time that they did it again the following year and they came back again and again. And over time, it turned into this campus that, transitioned from canvas tents to little ramshackle shacks. And then those shacks ended up growing into like more and more well formed buildings. And so it's this very organic growth. And I think when they first started hosting the first Chautauqua, they were not planning for it to ultimately become an entire permanent community, but then they just followed where instinct led them. And I think that that's part of why it feels like it feels so rooted and it is not kind of like arbitrarily placed there. So that's where it came from.
I think that sort of organic feeling is something that so many people desire. And I think in thinking about building new places is one of the harder things to attain because you're going through this right now and doing a master site plan. It's like you're trying to lock everything in for the next 50 years. And so achieving that sort of organic growth, incremental growth is hard. I'm curious sort of about how you feel now 150 years later. How is the hardware at Chautauqua? Because the software seems like that's what was there initially, that sort of culture of learning and everything, and that's developed into something much richer and fuller. But how is the hardware of Chautauqua grown over time, and do you feel like it's representative of the software that exists?
Good question. I think it's definitely grown over time, and it's interesting. You can kind of see how Chautauqua, as it's grown, has to some degree followed some of the patterns of American development broadly, where like the newest neighborhood that was built, which is on the north end of Chautauqua, does feel a little bit more suburban than the rest of it. It's still pretty nice, and I think it's better than like most of the sprawl that gets built, but it doesn't have quite the charm as like the core of Chautauqua. That's quite interesting to see, I think. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question though.
Sort of threw multiple questions in there. But I think that organic feeling is something that is probably easier attained through the software than the hardware, especially with how we're required to develop today.
Totally. I mean, just this morning I was like working with some of our site designers and urban planners, like talking about how the relationship of like the piazza to the entrance would work. And I'm thinking, man, like a lot of the decisions we're making this morning are going to last like 50 years or more. And by then, the world is going to look really different. Like one of the things we're thinking about is, how big should the drop off zone be? And right now, we think in this area, there's probably not a lot of drop offs. Most people probably come in a car and they park it in a parking lot or a parking spot, and then they like walk the rest of the time. But I think just in a few years, we're probably going to have a lot more self-driving cars. And certainly in 50 years, people are probably going to have like self-driving cars that drop them off and then go off. And so we're thinking like, do we want to build that in now and try to quote future proof it, which you can't really do.
Right.
What I just described may not be the future that actually unfolds. Maybe we'll have flying cars or something else completely different, or teleportation technology or something. I'm joking, but you just don't know quite what it's going to be. And so it is a little nerve wracking to lock so many of these things in. Like at this point, I feel like in past times before urban planning became so regulated, it was more malleable. Like you could just do something and then you could change it as the conditions changed. And yes, it was somewhat expensive. It's harder than changing some lines of code in software, but like you wouldn't have to go through this whole approvals process. Whereas now the approvals process is so long that you're only going to make modifications if it's like absolutely not working at all. You're going to like demolish the whole thing as opposed to like make smaller modifications. So that's definitely something that I think a lot about and try to think like, are there ways that we can build in opportunities for modification without having to like go through this full approvals process all over again?
There's bigger institutional changes that need to happen, but I've thought about this same thing because we actually just we got our initial approvals for our subdivision back in 2021, and we're designing it in 2020. So that plan is, we know how much our world has changed since 2020 till now. And just as an example of that, we were building at that same time. I think in 2021 and 2022, we experienced massive building cost increase. So we built less than 12 months apart. We built two homes and we sold one of them for $299. And less than 12 months later, we built the exact same floor plan for $399.
Wow.
And I think we probably made less money on that one than we did the $299. So our world has changed dramatically. We're dealing with more housing affordability issues than we have in the past. And so we just recently, the last 12 months, we've gone through a major PUD amendment for just our first phase is all that we got approved by the city to begin with. But we were just changing lot lines and adjusting to what the market wanted. And thankfully, the city was really great to work with. And it still took like 12 months to get all of those approvals done and through. And I mean, think about how expensive that is. And what if the market has changed again in that point? So I wonder often what the solution to that is. If things like a form-based code where it can be a little bit more, you've worked in software, but where we can make these changes quicker and don't have to lock everything in so far in advance. But we need the ability to be malleable and adjust to what the market needs.
Totally. One of the things that we're doing is there's a difference between discretionary and ministerial approvals. And with discretionary approvals, it's basically like a political process where, in our case, like council members would vote on something and it would be like a bigger discussion, basically. And then there's ministerial, which is like there's sort of more objective standards and city staff can be the ones to go through it. And it's that they have a full-time job, which is to like review, things as they go through, which can still take some time, but it's generally a faster, smoother process, especially since you have those more objective checklists. And one of the things that we've been doing is we have what's called a development agreement that we're working on with the city,
Mhm.
where we're taking things that usually would be discretionary and trying to front load all of those and create more ministerial checklists that reflect what the leadership like votes on. And so we have this like bigger process at the beginning where it does take longer for us to get these initial approvals, but then later steps will be easier. It's kind of like pre-vetting some of the decisions so that hopefully later those like iteration cycles can be tighter. And we'll see how that works out. I think it's going to be a really useful tool. And frankly, it actually is nice for the city too, because they don't want everything to be going up for a vote every single time. It creates a lot of extra work. And so if you can have those conversations ahead of time, then you can save both parties some headache and also provide more confidence that like it's going to be built the way that they hope and expect. But again, like those guidelines, those checklists that we're putting together, maybe those aren't going to be responsive to the market. And we may still, even if we could do it ministerially, we might say, actually, we want to go outside of these lines that we drew for ourselves. So we're going to be back in the discretionary bucket anyway. So I don't necessarily think that that's the full solution, but I think it's a tool that's at our disposal that can help.
Well, and right now, every jurisdiction, every municipality has different people and they're interpreting things their own way. So that's sort of the level that we have to solve these at is development by development, working out those development agreements with that city and coming to the solutions that's going to work. That more often we need just that private public partnership. There needs to be getting that understanding on both sides that we're both going the same direction, that we want to build something beautiful. You're saying like we don't want there to just be an open door for people to make changes because there's people that will take advantage of that system. Unfortunately, not everyone cares maybe as much as me or you about, building a place and doing it right. I try to tell the city that all the time. I'm like, I probably care about this more than you, that this gets done, that this gets done correctly. But I think if there's a way of building that trust, and I think the development agreement is a good way to do that, of setting some guidelines to this.
I'm so glad you used the word trust because I think that that's so core to this and core to basically everything people do. But I think especially with something like our projects, which are multi-decade endeavors that are going to continue to evolve even once they're completely done, trust is so key. And one of the things that we've done by hosting the Edge Esmeralda event, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, like is it gives us this opportunity to build those relationships in a context where we're not just asking for something, which you got to ask for stuff. It's not a bad thing, but it's better if you can like build a relationship with somebody and show that you have shared values and shared goals and that you keep your word to be able to show them that before you come out sort of with a request. And so I think that something that is very time consuming, but at least in our case, super completely worth it is like I think developers could spend more time building those relationships and those trusts. And I don't mean in like some dark room and, in the back or something. I mean like really out there and showing the community that what you're trying to do is something that they're going to like and is going to be really positive for them as well. And if we work together, we can make something more beautiful.
No, and I completely agree. I think establishing that trust, and you can do it, but it certainly takes groundwork. Town Builders is brought to you by Brett Jones, PA. Brett is a practicing land use lawyer in Florida and as a patron and advocate for new urbanism. He leverages his background in corporate law and personal development experience to help landowners and developers get entitlements and cut through red tape to build human-centric, walkable neighborhoods. Visit brettjonespa.com to find out more. I want to actually get into Esmeralda because there is an actual town that exists and land that is being looked at right now. So I'd love to walk through both the software. We'll probably start there, the software and the hardware of what Esmeralda is going to be. But I think to start, you brought up Esmeralda, which I think is a great place to start. So what is that?
Yeah, so Edge Esmeralda is a month-long event that you can kind of think of it as like a temporary college campus. And we currently host it about 15 minutes away from the site where we're building the permanent Esmeralda. And for the month of June each year, about 1,500 people come to live, work, learn together. The people range from our youngest attendee was 6 weeks old, and our oldest attendee so far was 86 years old. And we hope every year to expand that further. And it's basically like a temporary college campus where you can be surrounded by people of all different ages and different skills, and people, we both bring in experts on various topics to give talks and lectures. And we also have a lot of the people who actually attend themselves are the experts on various topics. And so they will, do a presentation or run a workshop to teach people how to do something. We've also had moments where people will build things together. So the first year, somebody organized what they called a solar A-frame build. So over the course of a few weeks during the month, they built this like A-frame camping structure that has solar panels on it. So it has like access to power, and they built it in the middle of the woods. And a bunch of people had never done like woodworking type of things before and that kind of small construction. And so they gathered a whole group of people and they taught them how to do it. And then at the end, we hosted like a dance party in the woods around the solar A-frame. And we were able to like plug in the speakers and stuff like that to get the power from the solar panels. So that's what Edge Esmeralda is. And it's really inspired by Chautauqua, the fact that it started as a temporary event as well. And then we're, I think, planning a little bit more than Chautauqua did, where we see how well that worked for Chautauqua. And so the idea for us is to transplant this event ultimately into the permanent village that we're building so that it has sort of a home base. And then it could potentially run all year round and we could have events. So that's Edge Esmeralda. And it started really from some events that I was hosting 7 years ago just for fun with some friends. And over time that grew and grew into this month-long 1,000+ person gathering. And I think being able to sort of just follow your nose and see like, this is something people like, what would it mean to do it more and bigger, is something that I have found to be very satisfying with the work that I do.
I think that's so cool, and like spontaneous things like that, being able to get together as a community. It sounds so cool, but like my first thoughts are like, okay, how do you actually how do you actually make that work? I'm especially in the stage where I have kids, and I'm like, I feel like I'm tied down on like every part of my life. So logistics wise, how do you actually pull something like that off?
Oh my gosh, great question. Logistics are really challenging. I think it's so much work. I think that the short answer is a lot of sleepless nights, but another part of the answer is collaborating with amazing partners. So there's this group called Edge City, and they do these pop up villages all around the world. And they had wanted to do something in Northern California. And so as I had done all of these smaller events that were starting to like grow, I always thought it would be very cool to do something bigger. But to your question, I was like, that sounds like a lot. And I'm already trying to build an entire community from scratch. So who's got time for that? And then Edge came to me and they're like, hey, we've been actually thinking of doing a pop up village in Northern California anyways. And we think that the story of what you're building is really cool. Let's collaborate. Like this could be a win-win where, they provide a lot of the blood, sweat, and tears to make the thing happen. And they bring a large group of people who are already excited about this sort of format. And on my side, bringing sort of local context, local expertise, and also this story of like, why is this pop-up village here? And so that's been a really great collaboration. And actually just yesterday or maybe the day before, we announced the dates for next year's Edge. It's going to be basically the month of June again. And I'm really grateful to get to collaborate with them on it because I definitely could not do this single-handedly. I would collapse under the weight of all of it. As fun as it is, it's kind of like hosting your own wedding every single day for 30 days straight. If you can imagine how tiring that would be.
Well, yeah, very tiring. How does the pop-up village thing actually work? Are you guys renting land, leasing land? Are people in tents? Are they getting Airbnbs and hotels? Like what does that look like? Are there vendors that pop up? And it sounds like you have these sort of seminars that happen on the weekends.
It's a mix of all the above, but I'll sort of describe what our nonprofit does, like the actual actions that we take, and then sort of like how other people can build on top of that. So, a metaphor I like to use is like we're kind of like the trellis, and then all of the activity is like a plant growing up the trellis.
Hmm.
And so we provide some basic structure, but all the cool stuff actually happens from everyone else who comes. What we do is we rent out several venues around. There's a small town called Healdsburg, which is close to our site. The closest town to our site is actually called Cloverdale, but they don't have a huge number of hotels, which is one of the reasons why we're so excited to build hotels. When we have over 1,000 people coming at a time, there's got to be a lot of places to keep people. So it's right now it's centered around Healdsburg, although ultimately it will be centered around our site and around Cloverdale. And in Healdsburg, there's a bunch of beautiful hotels and venues. We rent out the venues and we give people places where they can sign up to give talks. And each of the, let's say, 6 venues or so, we schedule like 1 or 2 anchor events per day in each of those venues so that we can like seed it a little bit with some interesting content. And we also, each week of the month has a different theme. So for example, one of the weeks that I was leading was called Cities of Tomorrow. And you can imagine like it's all about urban planning and what do we want cities of tomorrow look like and the places that we live. But there's other topics like climate change or cryptography. We've had all sorts of different topics that are really interesting, and health and longevity, stuff like that. And then people come and they either attend the sort of anchor events that we've set, and or they will sign up to host their own sessions and workshops. Say, hey, I really want to give a talk about street design or something like that at the Cities of
Mhm.
Tomorrow. And then they would come to me as like the organizer of that week and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. What's a good venue or a good time for me to host that relative to everything else? Or you could even just like throw something on the schedule and say, hey, I'm going to host a yoga session at like 10 a.m. on Thursday. Anyone who wants to come can come do yoga in the park with me. And there's flexibility for that too. And then there's also every Friday night, we have a community picnic where everybody has dinner together at a community park. And we like get permits and stuff like that because we bring such a big crowd. We have to be pretty careful about making sure that we have the permits to do everything, all the nitty gritty for getting things done. And then during the rest of the meals, we like pick various partner restaurants throughout the town and throughout the region where we say, hey, if you want to have like a social dinner, here's like a great spot to get dinner with everybody. And there's more to it than that, but that's sort of the core of the trellis that we build.
You're providing the structure for everyone else to have these interactions and these moments and learning opportunities.
Exactly. And we have like a big group chat as well where everybody can like coordinate with each other and be like, hey, I met this person at this lecture. Like, I didn't get their name. Can you? And then they'll like figure each other out. So we're building this like coordination layer and like, if you're an economics nerd, like a Schelling point of like, here's where to meet. But then actually everyone else kind of creates the magic on top of that.
People fill it in. Okay, so that's Edge Esmeralda. I'm curious about the site itself. Can you sort of paint us the picture of the land that you're looking at, how big it is, what you envision that's going to be actually placed on there?
Yeah. So the site is in California wine country, 90 minutes north of San Francisco. So if you cross the Golden Gate Bridge on the 101, you just keep going north for 90 minutes and you're right at our site. It's really easy to get to. And the drive up is gorgeous. Like it kind of feels like you're driving through Tuscany or somewhere like that with beautiful rolling hills. And then our site is in what's called the Alexander Valley. So there's these beautiful mountains that are all around it as well. And to the south of the site is a vineyard, and also to the east. And then to the west of the site is actually the highway. So we have like really easy access. And there's also something called the Smart Train, which currently doesn't make it all the way up to the site, but will probably in the next like 5 to 10 years. So you'll be able to take a train from basically our site down to Larkspur, which is where there's a ferry, and then you can take the ferry to San Francisco. So you could go from San Francisco to our site without getting in a car if you wanted. And the site itself has beautiful views. It's also right on the Russian River. And it's just sort of the classic rolling hills, California. In the springtime, there's orange poppies everywhere. It's really beautiful.
California live oaks, I'm sure, and
Yes, exactly. It's like meadows with live oaks everywhere. And one of our big goals is how do we design the site plan so that we preserve as many of those oaks as possible. And for the ones that we can't, we want to move them as opposed to killing them because they're just so gorgeous. And we're really trying to minimize the impact on those oaks because they're beautiful.
so how big is the actual site?
So the site is 266 acres, and we plan on developing about a quarter of that. And the reason for that is because we'd like everything to be, well, there's a bunch of reasons, but one is that we want everything to be in a walking distance and really quite tight and compact. And then what that allows is you can have this hard urban edge where you walk in one direction and you get your morning coffee. But if you walk the other direction, you have these beautiful meadows and agricultural spaces and you can get to the river. And I think that's an interesting contrast to the rest of the way America is really built, which is sort of like everybody gets a small amount of green space with maybe a front yard or backyard, but they don't use it that much. And then it spreads everything out. And so getting to nature is actually quite a schlep. You have to get into your car to get to nature. And the model that we really admire is, imagine like a small European village. It'll be quite compact, but then you can walk just a few minutes and you're in a big open space that is way bigger than your yard could ever be. And then also it allows us to preserve a lot more of the land for natural habitat, and just the beauty of the landscape is much more preserved as well. Although I will say our goal is that we hope that the development serves as sort of a way to accentuate the landscape as opposed to detracting from it. Like if you drive around Tuscany and you look at like a little village crowning the top of the hill, I don't think anyone thinks like, oh, it'd be prettier if that village wasn't there. I think the village is the crown that kind of completes the full picture. And that's the goal for what we'd like to do.
Well, and it's the fusion of you need to have people there to enjoy the nature. Humans have to exist in some form. We can't not develop, but it's about developing the right way. And I think keeping the tighter, denser sort of village urbanism, we don't have that almost anywhere, being able to, like you said, walk from a coffee shop into nature. It's
Totally.
such a wild idea, but I love that vision. What sort of product types exist, and are you thinking this is going to be like a primary home residence or a secondary home residence?
We think it'll be a mix. It's hard to know exactly what the breakdown will be, but I think there will definitely a significant second home residence just in wine country in California. That's like a big part of the market. And so we would expect to track with that. Also, because it's new build, it may be more likely to be, the ratio will probably be a bit higher of second homes. But I really want it to be a real place, a real community where people live, and it's not, the windows aren't all dark all year round. And so we're doing a lot to encourage it to be a full time community. One of the things that we have done is that because of Edge Esmeralda, there's already people who've been tracking this project for almost 3 years now who are really interested in buying a home there and potentially living there. And a bunch of them have now spoken, they've met other families, or they maybe already knew other families who are interested in that through Edge Esmeralda. And they're talking about like forming like a pod and being able to all live up there together. Because I think it's hard to move somewhere full time if you don't have at least a few friends there. But if you have a few friends who are moving around the same time as you, suddenly it's much more likely that you'll consider it as a permanent home. So that's something that we've been doing to encourage more of that, and also making sure that there's some of the services that you would need to have, a full-time community, and for it to make sense. It's a mix. And I think ensuring that it's not just like a resort community is something that's really high priority for us.
Well, is it something that you've thought about with, I'm sure you're planning on having commercial retail area, and how have you thought about the primary residence, secondary residence sort of percentages, and what you think is going to be a viable amount to make, your retail area work?
Yeah, and so I think like for the retail area to work, it does have to be a bit of a destination. Like I think especially for, we have a small site. Well, I guess one thing I didn't say is that the whole, we're going to build 605 residences, and there's also going to be a 200 key hotel, and those will be basically the people on site, and some portion of those residences will also be some senior living, because we'd like to have a range of ages there. And there's also, again, a strong senior living market in Sonoma County. And I think because it is relatively small, making sure that it's a place that people want to come to offsite is important. And they could either be people coming from just very close by, or from broader Sonoma County, or maybe even people coming up for the day or for the weekend from San Francisco. And so to be able to support that retail, I think it has to be a destination, which is one of my favorite answers, because like one of the questions we often get from locals is like, is this going to be a gated community that like excludes us? And the answer is not only no, but actually the opposite. Like we want people to come in because that's how our retail and commercial spaces will thrive. Like you can't support a coffee shop that well if you just have, the 600 residences that are there. And so I think it'll just feel a lot better if we bring a lot of people in from offsite.
It must be something in the American psyche, because that was when we were going through and showing, architectural renderings of what we were building. It looked nice. And without, price points or anything, people were like, it's nice. It's going to be a gated community and you're trying to separate yourself from the rest of the city. Like that's the first place that people go, is like expecting the worst. I want to take a moment to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Harvey Points. Harvey Points are architectural designers that have worked on new urbanist projects nationwide. With a blend of bold ideas and thoughtful design, they have experienced site planning everything from infill projects in pocket neighborhoods to master planned communities. During the site planning process, they develop floor plans that tailor fit to each lot, giving you a comprehensive plan to take forward. They also provide realistic 3D renderings that help the whole team visualize the project from early stages, as well as being a great tool to get city planners and council members on board to approve your new development. We all want to see more unique communities built, and Harvey Points would love to assist you in that pursuit. Visit their website, harveypoints.com, that's Harvey with a B, or follow them on Instagram at Harvey Points. I do think that Americans have sort of been burned by bad development. That's the only experience, is whenever something gets built, it's ugly, it's not beautiful, it doesn't serve me. We haven't done a good job of showing people the benefits of good development yet. So there's like a negative initial reaction.
Totally. And honestly, I think it's pretty justified.
Yeah.
Despite being on the receiving end of the negative aspects of that, where it like makes my life harder and your life harder, I get it. Like most of the stuff you look around is like, it doesn't have a soul. And we could talk for hours, I'm sure, about like why and what the problems are. But people have been burned. And so the initial reaction is they assume it's going to be bad until you prove otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, one of the things I found interesting is like in the Southeast, like around Georgia, Florida Panhandle, South Carolina, there's now a bit more of like a community of practice of developers who've done some interesting stuff, also in Oklahoma. And I'm not sure if this is true, but I get the sense that now that there's more examples that people can point to, it makes it easier for like local communities to understand like what it is that people are trying to do. Like, for example, in the Florida Panhandle, there's a bunch of the new urbanist communities like Alice Beach, Seaside, of course, Rosemary Beach, Watercolor, etc. And I think a big part of why it's possible to have so many, it's like sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because once people saw Seaside, then they're like, oh, that was great.
Yeah.
That's clearly one of the nicest things around. Let's have more of that. And if you can drive to see something and actually experience it yourself, then you realize that that is a good pattern to continue. But like one of the challenges that we have, and I would imagine you guys have up where you are too, is that there aren't really new urbanist examples nearby California wine country. Like really in most of California, there's not many examples.
West of the Rockies, there's not a lot of examples.
No, totally. It's like the whole region. And so when you say, oh, it's kind of like this place called Seaside in the Florida Panhandle, people in the California wine country don't go to the Florida Panhandle. They just don't. And so it's not the most useful reference. And so I think that both makes our life a lot harder and also points to an opportunity. Is like if we can get a few of these built, then suddenly I think that it'll start sort of like compounding and like building on itself.
I think the best example that we have close by is Seabrook. And if you haven't gone up there, Casey's project,
I have.
I think he's just done a phenomenal job. I was actually just there like a week ago. But there's people that I've run into. I mean, that's 7-hour drive. And there's people that I've run into that have been to that project, and immediately they're on a different level of commitment, where they're like, yes, I know what you're trying to do. In fact, the second person that bought a house here, they lived in Coeur d'Alene, like an hour and a half north of us. And they saw the project on the website. They knew urbanism. I forget if it was Seaside or where they made the connection. They drove down on a Saturday and made an offer on Monday. But they were like, I know what that's going to be. That was all the confidence they needed in the world to just like commit right away.
That gives me chills. It really does. No, I'm so grateful for what Casey has done with Seabrook, both because there's a part of me thinking like, is this just not possible on the West Coast? Is there something in our water that like makes it so that we can't build well? And so once I learned of Seabrook and I managed to go there, I think maybe 3 years ago, I mean 3.5, I was like, okay, we can do good stuff here
Yeah.
too.
I mean, that's about as middle of nowhere as you can get. Actually, there's a lot of places that are middle of nowhere in the West. But I
Yeah.
think the point being, and I've told this story before because I had a guy I was talking to that he was like, if we're talking on the economics of new urbanism, he's like, if what you build is so much better, then why does the market continue to reward tract developers and they continue to sell all of the homes that they build? It's simple because it's a supply issue. We have so much demand in the market that whatever is supplied to the market will get sucked up. But what we've seen is that in these other communities where an alternative has been offered, the market responds overwhelmingly, and the economics are just very clear on that.
Yeah, I think that that is part of it. I still think that there's a bit of a mystery to be solved because the premiums are so high. Like I actually did some analysis when we were fundraising last year. I did some analysis to show investors like just how much more money these projects make. And looking at Seabrook, for example, we were just talking about it. It commands a 92% premium compared to other new builds, very close to it. And I say new builds because a lot of the stuff near it is not new, and to sort of normalize, you do have to look at the new stuff. If you compare it to the old stuff, it just like blows it out of the water. I don't even remember what the numbers are, but they're obscene. Or if you look at Alice Beach, it's 143% premium over the market, and Serenbe in Georgia is at 129%. And those are not cherry picked. Like I have a full analysis of many of these communities, and they all fall in that range. And so, given that they do make more money, and also they often can have lower infrastructure costs actually because you're building less infrastructure. Like, I mentioned we're only going to be developing like a quarter of the site. That means that we don't have to build as many miles of road, pipe, electrical. And I still also have that question of like, why are people not doing more of this? And the best answer I've come up with is a sort of conservatism, and it does require you to do it also with taste. And
Mhm.
so I'll speak to both of those. I think like the conservatism is that people in the real estate industry basically do what they see has worked before. And then maybe they'll make some very small tweak to it. But basically, like they don't want to go out on a limb and do something different because it's been really interesting to talk to real estate investors and real estate folks in general compared to like the tech industry where I came from. Whereas in real estate, most investors I think are looking for something that's pretty stable and like with a little bit of upside. They're not looking for a 10x return most of the time or 100x. Whereas like in tech, I'm used to people being like, it's fine to get some zeros sometimes because like every once in a while you like invest in Facebook and that like pays for every one of the losers.
Right.
And there are real structural reasons why, by the way. I actually don't think that the tech mindset is the correct one for real estate because there are real capital costs. Simply buying our land is like tens of millions of dollars, right? Whereas you can build like the first version of Facebook was built by a college dropout on his like laptop, right? So I digress, but it's been really shocking to me how conservative I think real estate can sometimes be based on where I'm coming from. And I think people will look at the models that have these really high premiums and they'll say, yeah, but that's like across the country. That might not work here. We're taking on a lot of risk by doing that. And I actually agree, like, especially if you're doing something that's marginally better, like, let's say you built a normal suburban subdivision, but you just made the yards really small. That's like one step in the direction of new urbanism, but you're kind of like in this like local minimum where you get stuck. You now have like a place that's not walkable because it still has all the other characteristics of suburban sprawl, but now everyone just like also doesn't have a yard. And so it's just kind of worse. I think you have to like get over this hump and do a lot of things differently for you to end up in this like different category. And people are scared to do that. In our case, I think the way you solve this is by it has to be a lot better and not like a little bit better. And then the other thing I mentioned was the taste, which I'll speak to quickly. Like because real estate is so financialized, and one of the biggest things is just being able to raise the money and do all the numbers and understand the compounding and IRR and things like that. It filters for people who are really comfortable with numbers and spreadsheets. And once you add that filter on, if you also have to add the filter of people who have like good taste and really care about architecture and design and placemaking and spatial relationships, just the Venn diagram of people who are good and care about both of those things is really small. The first Venn diagram is like finance bros, and the second diagram is like architects. And there are very few people who are both of those things. So I think that's my working explanation. But to be honest, I don't find it totally satisfactory. I'd be curious if that resonates with you or if you'd add more to that theory.
No, I think so. I've been thinking about this recently because I watched my dad be a real estate developer, and he did everything from residential to self-storage and office buildings. And so that was my background. I loved the vision of a project coming together and putting a deal together. And that was my initial interest. And then sort of got into this new urbanism thing. And I always loved, two of my sisters are architects, always have had a love for architecture and design and that sort of thing. So we went further down that route. But as time has gone on, I've tried to think, what am I really doing? What is my interest? And I realize it's we're creating an environment for people. The word I kept coming back to is like creating an environment for human flourishing. Like, how do you create a habitat for humanity? And realizing that that is really what we're doing. That's much more of like a sociological question of how do people thrive? How do you create community? That sort of thing. And so you sort of went from real estate developer to now you're trying to curate this environment for humans. And both of them blend together, but it's a unique intersection. And I think the other aspect of this that you were touching on was that you do have to go far enough to make it hit right. I'm sure we've both been in places where you're like, okay, these people read New Urbanism in a textbook, but like it's not quite there. They have a rear loaded lot and these certain elements, like they check the boxes, but it didn't come together in the right way. There's sort of like a life that's missing here.
Absolutely. No, I won't name names, but I was talking to the chief investment officer of a really large real estate development group. And they're like, oh, yeah, we tried new urbanism. It doesn't work. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I really want to understand why it didn't work because you guys have all this experience, you know. And then he proceeded to like describe a few projects that they had tried. They kind of considered new urbanism. And he was like, yeah, just like they didn't make as much money and they were like expensive to build or whatever. And I was like, okay, that's really a good data point. I want to know because I don't want to like go down this path if like I think that like making sure that these are not just sustainable businesses, but things that like make tons of money is really important because then they can be self sustaining. And I also just think like people do value them and people will pay for things that they value. So, anyways, I was unhappy, but also pleased to hear this so that I could like learn about it. Right. I then looked up the communities that he mentioned and they're not new urbanism. Again, as you said, they have like the rear loaded alleys. They have a few of the like hallmarks of something that could work, but then it's basically just a normal suburban subdivision, but a little bit worse. And I too would prefer to live in a conventional subdivision that really does cater fully to the car and like it just leans into that way of being and does that well, than live in one of these ones that's kind of half in, half out.
Like fake hybrid.
Yeah, because it's not good for anything.
Well, and you know what? I think the thing that's missing, and I'll go back to Seabrook for this example, because this was like the first place that I experienced it, was there was something that was alive about it. And you could tell that someone had like poured themselves into it. Like that someone actually really cared about how that happened and it was programmed with software. So whether it was an individual, the fact was that it was programmed to have life in it. And that's where the software thing is so important to what we're talking about, that it takes on a life of its own. After the environment is set, what happens? How does it continue to, as you said, be a self-fulfilling prophecy of just this community continues to grow and get richer and deeper? How do you create that? I'm going to digress on another tangent that we are just touching on, but we'll weave it back in.
Great.
You're saying that you have to go a certain distance down this design route to really make it work well. And I think that that's so true. Right now, we're building our homes. I think that our lot costs and our home costs are actually pretty comparable to market rates. And we're doing a lot of things to save money in those areas. But we expect over time that there will be a premium simply because there's a demand in the market for a better product. But the topic whenever we're talking about real estate development is like attainable housing. And the question of like, why are you building such expensive homes? It's like, well, the reality is that construction costs are really high. We're not just trying to scam the market and get as much as we possibly can. New construction, especially nowadays, costs a ton of money. And people think that we have this idea that we're going to solve the housing issue by building bottom of the market new homes. It's like, that's not the reality in any other sphere. If you want an affordable car, you buy a $1,500 beater. and you move up to a new car. I think it's going to be a long time before I actually buy a new car, if ever. And people are trying to buy a new car right away. No, we need to just have supply in the market, and we need to have supply that's actually going to last. I think building sustainable products is how we're actually going to get out of this cycle of actually stabilizing our housing market and building places that last, that people want to invest in, and people can move up the ladder over time into communities that are really set in a good foundation.
I really like that car example that you gave. Yeah. Yeah, and I think a related thought that triggered was, I think a criticism people often have of new urbanism is like, oh, it's expensive. Like you're building something that's really nice, and there, but then it becomes expensive, and so that premium that I was talking about sounds really nice for the investors, but like, what if I can't afford it? And I do think that that's a real problem, but I think that the cause is a bit different than someone who would frame the question that way. I think the cause is that we've stopped building places like that for the most part. And so we have a scarcity. We're treating it like a scarce resource that we only have so many of them. And so then, of course, the price is going to go up. Whereas if you build a lot more of a really nice place, now suddenly the prices will go down. And I think we're so far away from that right now, which is, I think, unfortunate for the country and for most people, but fortunate for as an opportunity to make money. Whereas like if you can build the one nicest thing in a market, people will come to you. And I think the only way to solve that problem is to build more. It's like if there was 1 gallon of water left in the world, everyone would be bidding that up, and that would be the most expensive good ever. But if we can, like, I don't know, it's probably a bad metaphor, but like we should not treat it as a scarce resource, essentially, because we can build more.
So scarcity drives price. And I think what we're talking about is creating a new model for neighborhood development. How is this going to work? Can it actually compete in a capitalistic market? How are these things going to get funding? And I think that's a good sort of segue into Esmeralda and where you're at currently in that project is how are you organizing your capital stack and how are you funding the project?
Yeah, so that's another thing that we've done a bit differently than probably many real estate projects, although I think maybe the way we're approaching it has more similarities with a lot of new urbanist developers. Two things I'll highlight. One is a similarity with a lot of new urbanist developers is we're avoiding debt, especially early on in the process. And, debt has a real role to play, right? It increases leverage and can improve returns if things go well, but it can also like set a ticking time bomb. And we think that a lot of the value will accrue over time. And we're going to be making early upfront bets that will then pay off. And if when you have that ticking time bomb of debt, you can have challenges with that. So the land purchase is going to be without debt. And for some context also, we currently have an option on the property, and we're getting the final approvals before we actually close on the property, which is an important clarification. So we don't own the property yet, but when we do close on it, we would like to close on it without any debt. And we'd actually also like to build probably the infrastructure without any debt as well. And what that does is it gives us a longer runway. It does sort of directly reduce the returns, but our view is that if we can take bolder bets up front, we will then end up having a much better outcome in terms of the house prices that we can command down the road, which will more than pay for that time.
Sorry, explain that a little bit more. Are you saying that you're going to be building all the infrastructure up front, or are you going to be phasing the infrastructure?
We actually are debating that internally right now. I think most likely we'll build the infrastructure up front just because mobilization costs are quite high. So it doesn't save that much money to phase it necessarily, but that's not something that's locked in just yet. And we were actually just talking about that yesterday as a team.
Yeah, I guess it just depends measuring the carrying costs of the money versus mobilization costs. Which, if equity, you're not taking time bomb, but still affects that IRR number.
Absolutely.
That's what you're worried about.
Absolutely. And so in terms of the phasing, I actually have less of a strong opinion about that right now. And hopefully within a week or two, we're going to have clearer direction on exactly how we'll approach that. But in terms of the equity, yeah, we want to avoid that ticking time bomb. It doesn't mean we won't take on debt later. My view is like as you get closer to cash flow, it's like safer to take on debt. So we'll probably have like construction debt for the buildings and some other pieces of it, but sort of the early like land development phase, we'd like to avoid that. So that's one way in which it's like different from your, I think, conventional developer, although it's a little bit common in new urbanism.
As far as your investors, who are you looking to partner with? What type of investors are you looking to partner with?
Yeah, so our existing investors, we feel really lucky to have them. They're mostly people who have invested as a family because they care about this vision and they'd like to live in a place like this, or at least be able to visit a place like this. And they sort of see the ability for California to have a better pattern of development. So the folks that we've been working with so far have been really long term, and they see this as like a legacy project that will compound over years and probably decades, as opposed to having like really short termists, like they want to get their money out in like 4 years.
Right.
And so this whole project is probably going to cost on the order of like $800 million. And so we're continually going to have like opportunities to bring in more rounds of capital. And especially for these early phases, we want to keep that investor group sort of in that way, where people who are thinking really in the long term. I think like family offices and sort of like longer term funds that don't have like a very short fund life are definitely the best fit for this. And so we feel really lucky that we've been able to work with those people, because I do think that this type of project is much harder to do if you're working with investors who want to flip things in 4 years, because we're not going to get that multiple in 4 years, but in 10 years or 15 years, you're going to start to see much larger returns because of that compounding.
So, what's your pitch? How do you talk to people that are used to faster exits about the value of this more patient town building model?
One of the big benefits that this model has is that you can keep your money in a project and let it compound rather than having to reallocate it. I think when people calculate IRR, they kind of assume that they're going to be able to reallocate their capital immediately afterwards and into a really good project that also has that really high IRR. And that's not usually the reality. Allocating capital is actually hard, and finding good projects is actually hard. And so if you can just like keep it in a project and let it grow, that is often less work and also just sort of easier for it to grow over time in that way. So I think that's a big part of it, is not having those like gaps between allocation periods, which people often forget to account for. I think the other piece is with a project like this, you're taking a place that has relatively low values, like agricultural land values, or just empty land values, or in our case, is actually part of the site is like a former industrial site. So it's not super valuable land, and you're turning it into a place. And so you have this opportunity to create multiples on your money, as opposed to a lot of real estate investment, which I think is a lot more incremental. There is more risk associated with this too, because if you fail to create that place and you've poured a lot of money into it, then you're kind of like trying to create a market. And if you fail to make that market, the returns don't look as good.
I think you'll sort of have the corner on the market, though. We are just discussing nothing like this that exists. And if you are able to get the approvals to go through and do this, it's going to be a one of a kind type project. I
Absolutely.
wanted to touch on this point of like conservatism that you talked about, where I don't fault people. Development is a really risky business. It takes millions of dollars. Going through a project with the burden of millions of dollars, gaining interest on your back, it's like you better get it done and do it right, because there's not a lot of margin for error there. And I think a lot of people, certainly anyone that's been investing for a long time or has been around, a lot of people got burned in the 2008 housing crash. And I got to see that firsthand. And I think there's just been sort of a meagerness in the real estate industry since then. I've seen it in contractors, I've seen it in developers and builders, people not wanting to stick their necks out too far. But I think the hidden sort of the model is maximum 5-year timelines, IRR, get your money back out as quickly as possible and try to find another project to reinvest in. But I think that if you could look at a 20-year timeline, if you look historically at what's happening in our market and the real estate market nationally, and probably this is the same thing in most locales, is it's trending upwards. So if you're able to build a resilient model that can sustain downturns, because there will be downturns, we all know the direction that this is going. So if you have a financing group that can help get you through those downturns, we know what's coming up on the other side, which is an upturn.
Hmm.
And so you don't have to get caught with the market crashes and you pull all your money out at the bottom. You can just hold through and keep going, because we know it's coming back. People need housing. We're in such a housing shortage, and it's going to continue to be an issue through our lifetime.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the housing prices pre 2008 and now, like they have gone way up, including in the markets, some of the markets that were hardest hit, like Florida, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's another reason why you want to avoid debt, especially in those earlier, riskier stages, because the debt could be something that forces you to sell at a
Yes.
bad time. But if you can avoid that, then you can say, yeah, the market's bad right now, but we're just going to keep chugging away, keep building, or maybe even pause for a little while, take a beat,
Yeah.
and wait for it to come back. Then you can end up reaping those rewards.
Because debt will also force you to take shortcuts or do things that might end up hampering you long term, hampering the upside long term.
If you don't mind me asking one question, I'm curious how
Yep.
you guys have been approaching debt because it has its place. I think it's just about like not having it too early in the capital stack where it could like blow things up before you have any cash flow. So I'm kind of curious how you guys have been approaching that.
We're approaching it very similarly. Bought the land with equity and did the initial phase of infrastructure with equity. So that took us through the first several years of building. And now that we're moving into successive phases, we have taken on some debt, but we expect to have that debt on board for 2 to 3 years. And we're paying that back now that we're selling homes. We're paying off that debt quickly, and we expect to pay off that debt and then for successive phases be able to be selling homes and paying for successive phases with profits and just holding that equity all the way through.
That really matches how we're thinking about it too. And it just allows you to take more interesting risks. And if you mess up, you actually have some room also to adjust as opposed to being like, okay, got to sell the houses now.
And it's so great having investors, they're part of your team too. And having investors that believe in you and believe in the vision is so powerful because they have just full trust that they know that we're aligned, and they trust the vision of what we're doing. And so that's always been very helpful. But I do think it's certainly a different way of financing and funding the project. I'm curious, do you see this as sort of a new asset class that exists, this type of legacy project that are, their 20-year holds, that type of thing?
Well, I think it's new in the sense that new urbanism is new, where I think it's actually very old. Like it's a pattern that people have done for a long time. And if you look at like the world's richest families, a lot of them hold real estate. It's one of the asset classes that can be most stable over a very long period of time. And yes, it has its ups and downs, but it will often trend up, especially if you create a place that's really valuable and beloved. Actually, my husband and I were just walking around the other day and had a very morbid thought, but I think actually very relevant is if you think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they literally had nuclear bombs dropped on them. And if you go there today, they're like these beautiful, modern, bustling cities that people love living in. And yes, I'm sure that the real estate prices were pretty depressed shortly after the nuclear bombs were dropped, but it still came back because these were centers of places where people wanted to be and interact with each other. And they had this like blossoming over the following decades. And I think that that's once you've created a place as like a center where your family might live or people, business people that you know, and opportunities and people you went to school with, it's just really hard to dislodge that. It's not impossible. There have been examples,
Right.
but if Hiroshima and Nagasaki can make it through, I think that these places can be very resilient as well. And to pick a less morbid example, I think like another place that has done this differently than how I would, but still something to learn from is the Irvine Company in California.
Yeah.
Donald Bren, who's the owner of Irvine Co., is like one of the richest people in the world and certainly in real estate. And I think a big part of that is because they had a very clear vision of what they wanted to do and they compounded over decades. And it's not quite what I want to build. And I have to say, I'm very jealous of Donald Bren and his opportunity because I think we could have built the coolest new urbanist town ever where Irvine is. And he did, it's not quite how I'd approach it, but it is an example of being able to compound that growth over time. And many people really love living in Irvine. And so, yeah, I do think that it's an asset class that's really worth pursuing, but I also don't necessarily think it's new.
Yeah, well, and the other thing that you're bringing to this is not just the real estate side of it. It's a real estate project, but it's also a community project. That software is the thing that's going to have the most lasting resilience if you're able to create that really well. And you're certainly focusing, you're already at work on that. It sounds like you have a good foundation.
Chautauqua being a great model there, where it's like every year people they raise the gate prices. They have like tickets that you have to pay to be able to attend all the events and stuff. Every year they raise the prices way high, way more than inflation, and every year people complain, and every year people come back. everyone who loves Chautauqua is just like basically willing to pay whatever they need to pay to be there, because it's a place where they gather with family, they gather with friends, and it's irreplaceable.
So like you said, this is an old thing that exists and we're simply trying to bring it back. And the models and examples of where this has happened, you can make that argument, okay, well that works there, but it wouldn't work here. And I've heard that in a lot of different areas, but think about what's happened at Las Carolinas in Costa Rica, Seaside, and everything that's happening in the Panhandle. There's several around Atlanta. There's Seabrook on the Washington coast. Again, nothing is out there. We're doing it in Moscow and seeing success, and you're trying to do it in California. Wherever these have popped up, and sure, maybe you're not hearing about the ones that went under before they got started, but where this has happened and where you've been able to actually create some sort of mass, the data coming out of that is massively successful.
Absolutely.
So I see us in the early days of all you need is like a little bit more data. We're certainly in the early adapter stage of what I think will become a more fleshed out model of town building or village building, whatever that is.
Yeah, I think once there's more of a wealth of data points, especially in a particular region, suddenly it's gonna the machine is just gonna go. I just think it's just too sparse right now, and hopefully we can play a role in filling that in and showing how much money these can make.
Well, and the skids are still greased in one direction. Even locales, I think there's been a lot of progress made sort of on the new urbanism front, but on breaking down Euclidean zoning and having more product offerings of being able to create more unique projects. That's starting to exist in some municipalities, and certainly the conversation is people are more willing to have it. But everything, the zoning code, city planning departments, financing models are still all grease in one direction to just do R2 zone suburban sprawl. And the other issue that we haven't touched on that is that it's a singular product type that's being built. And so it's a really like monocropped type of development that back in the 60s, 70s, when we were starting to do that development style, it was families were the predominant demographic. I think it was something like 40 or 45% of people were families. That's now the third largest buyer group. It's now like 25% of the market, yet we're still building the same 2,200 square foot home, even though singles and empty nesters account for more of the market. So I think that we're just in a disconnect, and I don't think the market has corrected. I think real estate, because of a lot of things, it just takes a long time to make those changes and adjustments.
And I think the diversity in product type isn't just good for responding to the market, and it is good for responding to the market because I agree that is sort of the facts are quite clear, but it's also around diversification as you're building. Like this is actually another mystery. I don't 100% understand why people are just doing the cookie cutter, like build this one floor plan again, 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 because if you get that wrong, then like every single product that you've built is not quite something people want. Whereas if you can diversify a little bit, then you can sort of test different things in the market and then scale up. And I think again, like with this mystery, my best hypothesis is like it's something like maybe it's because they see how much more efficient it is to build one floor plan again, again, again. On the cost side, it is lower, but then you don't realize it's harder to tell what you're giving up on the revenue side or like in terms of risk. Those are harder to measure. And so my guess is that home builders are sort of like over indexing on that. But I think another thing that is related to this is like you might wonder like why am I doing such a big project, and people probably ask you that too. Is like part of it is because of the things like the Euclidean zoning, for example. It's really hard to tackle those if you're building a handful of homes at a time and you're sort of just a home builder who goes out and like buys some lots and builds the homes, versus if you build an entire neighborhood or an entire community, suddenly you can sort of change the rules within that zone. So I mentioned earlier the development agreement that we're doing. We're also doing something called a specific plan. I don't know what it's called where you guys are, but we have a specific plan which basically says there's this part of the municipality that is going to basically have different rules. And those rules have been approved by the council and the planning commission. We didn't just like make them up, but they are different. And so then we have something called village residential and village commercial, village mixed use.
Mm-hmm.
And we define those rules. And we can do that because we're working at a big enough scale that we can pay the costs, basically, like the legal costs of doing this.
Yeah.
But if you're building a handful of homes, like you're not going to challenge that zoning. It does not make sense.
Well, and I think what you're talking about is a difference of scales the reason why it works for the national builders to just build all the same product type is that they've already gone through that scale phase, and they're building a spot like Dallas where they know, hey, there's a market here for us to build 500 of the same home. Now we're working at a different scale than like an incremental builder, but the scale we're working at is a smaller scale in the sense that right now we're building everything from like a 399,000 square foot cottage to like a $1.5 million custom home. And in that we have everything price point wise across the board. And we have options to build where the market is demanding. So if we go into next year and there's not a custom home market, great. We can just build a bunch of lower end housing, and we can adjust the market because we have those different product types throughout our neighborhood that we can flex our construction team in different directions based on what the market is telling us. And so that provides us a lot of flexibility. In fact, we weren't planning on doing custom homes, but it was the market was slow, and that's what the market people just started asking us if we could build custom homes. And you're like, yeah, I guess we can. We do now.
How did they ask you? Did they just like, how did they know to ask? I'm curious, like the mechanics of like how they actually communicated.
Well, so for us, Wins Company is the developer and we're also the home builder here. And so we're not inviting other builders into the subdivision, but we have a certain style and quality in which we're building. And so I think people just started coming to us. We're like, hey, I want to buy a lot and build a house. And at first we were like, we don't do that. And then we were like, okay, I guess we could do it. Here's the parameters with which we'd be willing to do that. And so now we've just sort of fleshed that out a little bit more. And
Hmm.
it's just become something that we decided we were going to offer because it does provide extra flexibility and resilience for the neighborhood, and it gets really interesting, beautiful homes built that we don't have to try to build out on a speculative basis.
Totally. It probably adds a little bit more visual interest. Like in Seabrook, Casey, I know, has done something similar where a lot of the homes are a little bit more, I mean, they're still beautiful, but they're a little bit more formulaic. And then in a few key locations, they've got these beautiful custom homes that are like maybe a terminating vista ends on
Hmm.
one of the homes. And so it makes the whole block feel really special and more custom than it would
Right.
if like they were, but at the same time, you get some of the benefits also of like the scale and a little bit more of the like replication. So I mean, I think it's a really smart strategy, and I would love to ask you more about
And
that.
it's a delicate balance too, because custom home building is its own thing, and we don't want to just get overwhelmed and consumed by that. So I think what we've done now is for each phase, our corner lots, we do have a couple bigger lots around that we've just identified with a red star, and we're like, each year we'll have 3 to 4 lots that we offer as custom build lots. And then just you're creating scarcity of product too, and we can just keep forging ahead with what our plan for the neighborhood is and get these different homes built. So a little bit for everyone.
How many homes are you guys building in a given year right now?
So right now we've been building like 10 to 15, and we're just sort of in our ramp up. I think this next year we'll be at 20, and that's been our goal of what we think the market can absorb. Now what we're trying now is through marketing and different sales efforts, can we push that to 25, 30? But initially when we were coming in, we felt like that's what the local market could absorb as far as like new homes.
Amazing. That's so cool. Is I don't know if you want this part to be in the podcast, but if there's anything I can do to help, also like I know some people who've been interested in moving to the region and stuff like that. If I could like write about it or tweet about it or something like that, that to get the word out. It's probably a drop in the bucket, but any little bit might, find somebody.
No, everything helps, and I could do the same. So I love what you're doing, Devin. And there's so many questions I didn't get to ask you, but we'll end with this one, which is, what is your why? Why is this what you're doing? Because there's a lot of other things that wouldn't be quite as hard that you could be making more money on than doing what you're doing. So why have you chosen this as your path?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say there's sort of two interrelated reasons. The first one is I just can't stop thinking about it. Back when I was in software, I'd spend much of my day walking around just thinking about how much better places could be. And it made me like just sad that things are not nicer. And it's kind of like an obsession and it was kind of consuming. So that's, I think, the immediate reason. I think the longer term reason is going to sound corny, but I want to raise my family in a place like this, and it's hard to find. And I'm married. One day I hope to have kids, and I'd like my kids to grow up in a place like Chautauqua, but also in California. And so just selfishly, I'm trying to build a place that I actually want to live in. And I think that other people will love it too. I first thought, oh, maybe I'll just like build a custom home for myself, but that really wouldn't actually achieve it. Like, even if it was a beautiful home that was impeccably designed and I loved every detail, it's really about the environment that it's in and the community that's embedded in, much more so than any detail about the house. And so it made me realize, like, I just have to work at a bigger scale. I can't just build one house at a time to achieve the goals that I have.
I love that you've just taken that on yourself as the agency to like, well, it doesn't exist, so I'm just going to do it myself. And I think that's a beautiful message.
Thank you. And last thing I'll say is my husband jokes that like a lot of women, when they're like thinking about, raising a family, they'll like nest and they'll like, design like the nursery or something. But he's like, you have to build an entire village to be able to like nest for your future children. And I'm like, honestly, that's not wrong. So he has a point there.
That's great. Well, Devon, thank you so much for coming on. And where can people follow along with what you're doing?
Yeah, so we've got a website called Esmeralda.org, which has information both about the nonprofit that hosts the events, and then also the development company that is building the village. And then also I am on Twitter at Devon Zuegel, which is hard to spell, so you could probably look at the title of the podcast episode to get that. And also my email is on the company website as well if you ever want to reach out.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully I spell your name right and people can find you. So
It's a toughie. It's a toughie. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
thank you for coming on. Thank you everyone for tuning in and listening.